As the convicted spy, Major John Andre, met his end on the gallows, one spectator felt a tear running down his cheek. Though he knows he isn't alone, he quickly composes himself, takes one last look at his dangling adversary, and melts away into the crowd. While he feels a sense of satisfaction, he also cannot help feeling a tinge of regret. Andre had hung because of him. If it wasn't for him, Andre might have been able to flee alongside the traitor Benedict Arnold. Indeed, he was initially sent back to Arnold after his capture. After all, the local commanding officer reasoned, how could the hero of Saratoga be a traitor? But the young major wasn't going to let that happen. As Washington's spy master, he knew there were no such things as coincidences. But who was this extraordinary young officer? His name was Benjamin Tallmadge, and today we'll dive into the wartime adventures of Washington's chief spy. Welcome to America's Forgotten Founders, where we will look at people whose contributions to the American Revolution, whether on the battlefield, in the halls of power, or on the home front, have been all but forgotten by the annals of history. Benjamin Tallmadge was born in Setauket, a small hamlet in Brookhaven, New York, on February 25, 1754. He was the second of 5 sons born to Reverend Benjamin Tallmadge Sr. and Susanna Smith. We know little of the spy master's early life. In his posthumously published memoir, Tallmadge spent just 2 pages talking about his life before the American Revolution. Benjamin Sr. provided his son with the best education available. Under his father's tutelage, young Benjamin mastered the classics of Greek and Latin, and by 1766, at the age of 12, was tacitly accepted to Yale College. His father did not believe he was ready, though, and Benjamin didn't start classes until age 15 in 1769. By his own admission, his first 2 years of college were a breeze. Being so well versed in the Latin and Greek languages, he wrote, I had not much occasion to study during the first 2 years of my collegiate life. While coasting through his first 2 years, Benjamin became close friends with fellow student Nathan Hale. After graduating from Yale in 1773, he quickly found work as the superintendent of Wethersfield High School, where he would remain until the beginning of the American Revolution. Despite initial reservations, Tallmadge was convinced to join the Continental Army by his friend Colonel John Chester. On June 20th, 1776, Benjamin Tallmadge was commissioned a lieutenant and appointed as Chester's aide-de-camp. His first taste of combat came at the Battle of Long Island in August of that year. In his memoir, Tallmadge writes that his older brother, William Tallmadge, was taken prisoner, literally starved to death, while in British captivity. Despite the battle being a disaster for the American forces, Tallmadge performed well, organizing the rear guard, and was promoted to captain on December 14, 1776. George Washington assigned Captain Tallmadge to command the new 1st Troop of the 2nd Dragoons. After successfully raising, training, and equipping this unit, Tallmadge was promoted again to Major on April 7, 1777. He commanded his men throughout the 1777 campaign, fighting in the major battles of Brandywine and Germantown. After the campaigning season ended in early December, Major Tallmadge was ordered by Washington to observe the no-man's land between the British at Philadelphia and the Continental Army at Valley Forge. This Tallmadge did for the better part of a month before being relieved in January. Because they were an elite unit, the Dragoons wintered in the town of Chatham, New Jersey, where they were permitted to rest from the fatigues of a severe and blood campaign in relative comfort. Tallmadge and his dragoons would fight at the Battle of Monmouth on June 28, 1778, as the British withdrew from Philadelphia. After this decisive battle, Tallmadge would become Washington's spy master, taking over from Nathaniel Sackett, who had lost the confidence of the commander-in-chief. Where Sackett preferred sending his spies on one-time intelligence-gathering missions, Tallmadge instead opted for long-term embedment and with a secure line of communication. His friend Nathan Hale had died on one of Sackett's missions. By November 1778, Tallmadge was officially Washington's intelligence chief and recruited his first agent, Abraham Woodhull. Woodhull was a childhood friend currently imprisoned by the Continental Army for smuggling goods between British-occupied New York City and the rebel-held areas of the state. With Washington's blessing, Woodhull was released from prison and returned home to begin his career as a spy. As we said in our episode about Cato Howe, being a good spy means leaving little evidence. Tallmadge took the protection of his agents very seriously. Not even George Washington knew the identity of all the operatives, and Tallmadge never discussed his espionage work. In his memoir, he condenses his espionage career into a single, vague paragraph. This year, 1778, I opened a private correspondence with some persons in New York for General Washington, which lasted through the war. How beneficial it was to the commander-in-chief is evidenced by his continuing the same to the close of the war. I kept one or more boats continually employed in crossing the Sound on this business. That's it. Why would Tallmadge, a man who wrote at length about his experiences on the battlefield, write so frustratingly little about his time leading the most effective espionage ring of the American Revolution? There are several possible reasons Tallmadge minced his words. To begin with, many of the operatives were personal friends. 5 of the primary members of the espionage ring, Abraham Woodhull, Austin Rowe, Caleb Brewster, Jonas Hawkins, and Anna Smith Strong, were all residents of Setauket, who Tallmadge knew in his youth. He likely felt a strong desire to protect them, not just on a professional level, but also on a personal one too. But protect them from what? When Tallmadge died in 1835, only one agent, Robert Townshend, was still alive, and he would die 3 years after Tallmadge. Tallmadge wasn't protecting his agents from physical violence, so what exactly was he protecting? Their honor. Spying has always had a dishonorable air to it, even if it was done for the cause of liberty, as Woodhull put it in his letters to Tallmadge. Tallmadge and Woodhull, let alone Washington, were respectable men from respectable families. Woodhull's father was a judge. To denigrate themselves a spy, especially one that snuck around in the dark, would be an affront to their honor. So the American public remained unaware of the ring's very existence until the 1930s. Since then, historians have been left to piece together the story of the Culper Ring from archival evidence. While great strides have been made, there is plenty of work left to do. A letter between Robert Townshend, a Culper agent, and Tallmadge was first discovered in August 2020 at the Long Island Museum. All that said, we will present the most compelling narrative of the ring and Benjamin's role as the leader that we can. At first, the Culper Ring consisted only of Woodhull, Brewster, Tallmadge, and Washington. Here's how their early intelligence-gathering operations worked. Woodhull would travel from Setauket to New York City every couple of weeks to visit his sister. While in New York City, Woodhull would compile reports about troop disposition, morale, and supply ships in New York Harbor. After he returned to Setauket, Brewster, a whaleboat captain, would take the letters across the Long Island Sound to Tallmadge at Fairfield, Connecticut. Brewster would occasionally incorporate his own information into the reports. For example, he informed Tallmadge in late January 1779 that the British were outfitting privateers to operate in the Long Island Sound. Once Tallmadge received the information, he dispatched a courier to take the report to Washington. Despite the success of these initial operations, Woodhull became increasingly paranoid about making the trips. He knew full well that the British were suspicious of him. His early release from rebel prison was suspicious. His frequent trips to New York City, too, drew attention. Surely nobody would make such frequent visits to their sister when they had elderly parents at home. To try and mollify these genuine concerns of his childhood friend, Tallmadge got Jonas Hawkins and Austin Rowe to act as couriers between Abraham, who would remain at his sister's boarding house, and Brewster in January 1779. These men, who could masquerade as merchants, were also childhood friends of Tallmadge and Woodhull. At this stage, the ring consisted solely of close friends. These early changes to the ring significantly increased its efficiency in several ways. Letters from Woodhull could reach Washington in as little as a week, providing the commander-in-chief with more actionable intel. And since he didn't have to trek through the New York countryside, Woodhull had more time to assiduously tour the British positions in the city, providing Washington accurate reports on British troop strength and updates on a secret shipbuilding campaign by General Clinton. Although the operation was churning out valuable intelligence, Tallmadge was concerned. The letters were mainly written, uncoded in black ink. If the British got their hands on one of those letters, it could spell the end of the spy ring and the death of his friends. And since more letters were being transited across enemy territory, there were more chances for discovery. That's where John Jay's brother, James, a hobby chemist, came to the rescue. James, who was still sympathetic to the Patriot cause, sent John several vials of what Washington later termed sympathetic strain for invisible writing. By April 1779, Woodhull finally received this ink. He quickly began using it for his correspondence. Because, however, this sympathetic strain was difficult for Jay to produce, Washington and Tallmadge continued communicating in regular black ink. This decision almost cost Tallmadge everything. The British captured a June 13th letter from Washington to Tallmadge. The letter identified Major Tallmadge as Washington's chief of intelligence. Understanding the potential intelligence coup, Colonel Bonastre Tarleton ventured into enemy territory and raided Tallmadge's camp on July 2nd, 1779. Despite his prize, Tallmadge, fleeing into the woods and evading capture, Tarleton's men captured his horse. The horse had several saddlebags filled with correspondence detailing an agent in New York City referred to as C-R and his potential replacement, George Hidgay. Needless to say, Hidgay was promptly arrested by British authorities. Although it was known he was corresponding with Washington, Clinton spared the man's life, knowing his value as a spy was over. Nonetheless, the British now knew a spy ring was operating in New York City, and Tallmadge was the master. The raid shook Tallmadge to his core. How had Tarleton known the exact location of his camp? Tallmadge quickly began developing a cipher to protect himself, Washington, and most importantly, his agents in enemy territory. The code he developed was relatively simple, but nonetheless effective. He compiled a list of 710 words he thought were the most common and assigned each a number. For example, mercy, 385, moment, 386, and so on. He also included 53 numbers to denote proper names. George Washington was 711, Tallmadge was 721, Samuel Culper was 722. For words not listed in the dictionary, Tallmadge devised a mixed alphabet scheme. Here, we will display the substitution cipher on the screen for a few seconds, so make sure now to pause the video if you want a closer inspection. The dictionary Tallmadge wrote was then secreted to the ring's members. The dictionary, along with the sympathetic strain of invisible ink, greatly increased operational security. Though the code was simplistic and had several fundamental flaws, it was good enough. That's as much as we're going to get into the cipher. If you want a more nuanced look at how it all worked, make sure to check out Alexander Rose's Washington Spies, the story of America's first spy ring. As Tallmadge was looking over his shoulder and writing his code book, Woodhull was forced to lay low. A captured privateer informed the British that Woodhull was up to something dubious. Woodhull's early release from prison, his frequent trips to New York City, and the words of a Continental privateer drew the ire of Colonel John Simcoe, the commander of the Queen's Rangers. When he returned to Setauket, Woodhull found his father beaten, their house ransacked, and a very angry Simcoe that was ready to string him up from the nearest tree. It was at this very moment that an unlikely savior, Captain Benjamin Floyd, saved Abraham's life by convincing Simcoe that the Woodhulls were loyal to the crown. Captain Floyd, a lifetime Setauket resident, was a well-known loyalist. Simcoe relented, and Woodhull lived to tell the tale. His usefulness as an agent in New York City, however, was over. Luckily for the Culper Ring, Woodhull had recruited another agent in the city, Robert Townshend. With Culper Sr. unavailable, Culper Jr. got to work. His business sold rum, grog, and spirits to British officers, soldiers, and sailors. As many of his customers were inebriated, Townshend asked innocent questions. To augment this flow of information, Townshend frequented the taverns and coffee shops of New York. One of those he jointly owned with a loyalist named James Rivington. As it so happened, Rivington printed a small loyalist paper and needed a journalist to conduct interviews with leading British officials. Would Townshend help him out? Townshend couldn't believe his luck. He accepted, and his journalistic career gained him access to the highest levels of the British civil and military administration. Townshend gathered a wide array of intelligence for the rest of the war. Here are just two examples. In early 1780, Townshend reported that the British were going to flood the market with counterfeit continental currency. Using this information, Congress recalled all bills in circulation and reprinted them on different paper. The recall prevented total economic collapse. Later that year, Townshend informed Washington that the British were going to try and destroy a French transport fleet before it had a chance to land at Newport, Rhode Island. With this intelligence, Washington prepared a fake attack on New York City. As it seemed an assault on the city was imminent, General Clinton abandoned his plans to engage the French fleet and decided instead to strengthen his defenses for an attack that would never come. Though the Culper Ring would continue to expand and remain active to a lesser degree until the very end of the war, submitting their very last report on September 19, 1782, this is where we're going to end our story of the Culper Ring and Tallmadge's role as their spy master. While leading the Culper Ring, Tallmadge had continued commanding his dragoons near New York City. That's where he was when, on September 23, 1780, he learned that a John Anderson had been captured carrying documents signed by Benedict Arnold, the commander of West Point. Tallmadge immediately went to speak with the commanding officer of the men who had arrested Anderson. After arriving, Tallmadge was enraged that Lieutenant Colonel Jameson had sent both the letter and the prisoner back to Arnold. The spy master convinced Jameson to recall the prisoner and dispatch a letter to Washington. After Andre was hauled back to see Tallmadge, he admitted to his real identity. At this point, by his own admission, Tallmadge's emotions were wholly indescribable. He was livid at Jameson. No matter what he did, Tallmadge knew Arnold would escape. Tallmadge then guarded Andre during his last days, developing a profound respect for the man. Shortly after Andre's execution, Tallmadge commanded his dragoons on a daring 2-day raid on British-held New York. On the first day, his men burned down a massive plantation, Manor St. George, and 300 tons of hay that was being stockpiled for winter. The next day, the major led his men in a surprise attack on Fort St. George, capturing the fortification with their weapons unloaded and their bayonets fixed. His men suffered 1 wounded, but 7 enemy soldiers were killed and 54 were taken prisoner, many of them wounded. the small force burned the fort's stores and withdrew with their captives in tow. Upon hearing of his raid, Washington congratulated Tallmadge on a job well done. I have received with much pleasure the report of your successful enterprise upon Fort St. George, and was pleased with the destruction of the hay at Coram, which must be severely felt by the enemy at this time. I beg you to accept my thanks for your spirited execution of this business. Shortly afterward, Tallmadge officially joined Washington's staff, where he would serve until the formal disbandment of the Continental Army in November 1783. As thanks for his services during the war, Washington promoted Tallmadge to the rank of lieutenant colonel on September 30th, 1783. After the war, Tallmadge finally found time to start a family. On March 18th, 1784, Benjamin married Mary Floyd, a niece of the loyalist Captain Floyd that had saved Woodhull's life during the American Revolution. The couple would go on to have 7 children. Throughout the 1780s and 1790s, Tallmadge played a central role in the Society of the Cincinnati of Connecticut, serving as assistant treasurer, vice president, and president. During the 1790s, he served as the postmaster of Litchfield, Connecticut, while also running a successful mercantile business. He was also the first president of the Phoenix Branch Bank from 1814 to 1826. In 1801, Tallmadge took his political aspirations to the next level, being elected to the House of Representatives. He served for 16 years before retiring from public life in March 1817. Benjamin Tallmadge would remain active in business affairs until his death at the ripe old age of 81 on March 7, 1835, in Litchfield, Connecticut. What can be said, then, of Benjamin Tallmadge, the soldier, businessman, politician, and spy master? While he was a decent enough soldier, as evidenced by his raid on Fort St. George, his primary contributions to the American Revolution lay in his espionage work. Though it's impossible to say how much impact the actions of the Culper Ring had in determining the outcome of the war, they certainly provided Washington with a constant stream of valuable intelligence. During the height of their espionage activities, American independence was not guaranteed, and their intel helped Washington plan accordingly. The Culper Ring played a central, if oftentimes romanticized, role in securing American independence. Thank you for taking this journey with us through the American Revolution. We hope you have gained a better understanding of the complexity of the time period and the people who helped lay the foundation of the United States of America. Thank you for watching, and hopefully we will see you again in the future. Stay tuned for our future projects.